A Friend Request, written by Paul Sear, Chapter 5, Understanding Krishna Consciousness. This final chapter will be the most intimate information concerning the devotional service of the Lord. The information of the first 4 chapters of this text can basically be applied to any theistic faith. If one can understand that there is one Lord, known differently by many, one can apply this understanding to another faith and reap the benefit of this philosophy. The impersonal approach to understanding the Supreme is encapsulated in the Buddhist philosophy and those who study Vedic knowledge from the impersonal point of view. Those who study the Vedas in this way are known as Mayavad philosophers or impersonalists. For the impersonalists, there is no real theism because the relationship of loving reciprocation between the spiritual living entity and the Supreme Spirit is not accepted. One who has embraced the impersonal conception of the Supreme has a long, tedious road to self-realization, and their ultimate success is only partial. The Lord adamantly advises us to avoid the embrace of such a conception of the Supreme. There is so much trouble involved in transversing the impersonal path. The personalists, those who study the Vedas from the point of view of executing loving service to the Supreme, accept Krishna as a supreme absolute truth. Krishna is accepted by all the great authorities referenced in Vedic truths. So, this intimate information concerning the Lord's service is referred to as Krishna consciousness. One will see as one advances in this science that knowledge of Krishna is liberation. Ignorance of the Lord equates to bondage. There really is no limit to the understanding of Krishna. At no point does one come to the highest level in Krishna consciousness because the glories of the Lord are limitless. Therefore, the devotees of the Lord are always eager to understand more and more about the confidential activities, qualities, and opulence of the Lord. The devotee never comes to the conclusion that he now knows Krishna in total. There is always more to understand in Krishna consciousness. This subject matter of Krishna consciousness is very confidential in reality. The Bhagavad Gita is the preliminary study of the Lord's intimate activities. There needs to be a general cleansing of the heart to enter into the Lord's service. The knowledge within the Bhagavad Gita is sufficient for cleansing the heart of all dirty things. As one assimilates the knowledge of the Bhagavad Gita, one will become more and more purified of the materialistic conception of life. At the culmination of one's study of the Gita, one is expected to toss aside the materialistic conception of life and fully engage in the Lord's transcendental service without exception. At this point, one becomes qualified to enter into the most intimate aspects of Krishna consciousness. For one who has not reached such a purified consciousness, for one who still has material motivations in the heart, the Bhagavad Gita is sufficient for studying the Lord and His service. Everything needed to reach this attitude of unallied service to the Lord is revealed by the Lord in the Bhagavad Gita. One who is trying their best to understand the truths in the Bhagavad Gita is certainly on the path towards the unallied service of the Lord and is therefore a very fortunate soul indeed. So, in this chapter, I'm going to illustrate all the main principles of Krishna consciousness. See, the principles of developing love for the Lord are very simple in reality, almost so simple that the complicated person has a tendency to miss them. All the concepts of reciprocating love between two individuals are represented in these principles. When most think of God, often they will immediately profess that God is great. The Lord certainly is great. However, due to a want for proper understanding, most cannot fathom how great the Lord actually is. Most envision the Lord to be burdened down with the maintenance of this world, similar to Atlas carrying the globe upon the back with great difficulty. The sustenance of this material world is certainly not a full-time occupation for the Lord. Simply by the will of the Lord, everything is going on exactly as the Lord desires. The Lord is only the ultimate cause of this material manifestation. The immediate cause is being conducted through the medium of the Lord's inconceivable potency. In one sense, the Lord is everything, because all is resting upon His various energies. The energy is not different from the energetic. Therefore, one can define everything as non-different from the Lord. However, the Lord is not confounded by any of His various energies. Everything is situated in the Lord, yet still the Lord exists apart from everything created. The Lord confirms this in the Bhagavad Gita as follows. Bhagavad Gita, chapter 9, texts 4 and 5. By me, in my unmanifested form, this entire universe is pervaded. All beings are in me, but I am not in them. And yet everything that is created does not rest in me. Behold my mystic opulence. Although I am the maintainer of all living entities, and although I am everywhere, still myself is the very source of creation. So the Lord is not directly concerned with the maintenance of this cosmic manifestation. Everything is going on in full order simply because the Lord desires it to. This material realm is an opportunity for the spiritual living entities to live in separation from the Lord. This is not possible in reality because we are all also defined as one of the energies of the Lord. The spirit soul, the eternal parts and parcels of the Lord, are defined as the pleasure potency of the Lord. We exist to engage in loving exchanges and reciprocating relationships with the Lord. So it is natural to love the Lord because this is our eternal occupation. In this world of matter, all have forgotten this occupation. Therefore, there is nothing to be sought after outside ourselves in developing the loving attitude towards the Lord. This tendency to serve the Lord in loving service is already inside us. It is a matter of reestablishing the mood of loving service to the Lord as our primary activity. Now, in the verse I quoted from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 9, text 4, the Lord declares that He is not in us. This should be understood appropriately. This does not mean that the Lord has forsaken us in any way. All of us, as eternal spiritual beings, are situated in the Lord. This means we are within Him. Similar to how the proprietor of an energy is free to wield their energy as they desire, the Lord can act through us at His discretion. We certainly have independence, and the Lord does not interfere with our free will. Yet, we are helpless in fulfilling our desires. Similar to how a nest of baby birds are desiring some food because they are hungry. The babies are completely dependent on the mother bird to deliver foodstuff for their sustenance. In the same way, the Lord can understand our hearts and is maintaining us completely. Now, in the material conception, there is the idea of an object being diminished when a portion of its whole is separated. This is not so in the absolute conception. 1 minus 1 equals 1. Therefore, in a sense, we are all expansions of the Lord, just as in a sense, every molecule of sunlight is an expansion of the sun. The Lord does not interfere with our independence as individuals, yet still we are all contained within the Lord. When the Lord says, I am not in them, this means He is not contained within us. This is the division between ourselves and the Lord. We are contained within Him, yet the Lord's existence is not encapsulated within us. If the Lord is not directly engaged in maintaining us and this cosmic manifestation as His main business, what is He doing? The Lord is eternally engaged in the spiritual world, engaged in loving exchanges with His many devotees. Now, all relationships that we are familiar with here in this world exist in the spiritual realm. However, the Lord is the center of all affection in the relationships in the spiritual abode. These relationships in the material realm being a reflection of the spiritual reality. So we are situated here in material consciousness, imagining ourselves to be the center of loving exchanges with others. Even when we are engaged in serving others in relation to our material bodies, we are so engaged due to some desire for our own satisfaction. Somehow, we must transfer our consciousness from this material reality to the spiritual consciousness, where the Lord's satisfaction is the objective. In this chapter, I shall illustrate the process for making this transition to the spiritual reality. It is very simple in reality. Try to envision what is taking place in the spiritual realm. All the things that are pleasant to us here exist there in the spiritual abode. Generally, the ultimate pleasure is experienced in loving exchanges with others. So, this regulated activity performed in the mood of service to the Lord, performed here, is like a training session for what one shall be engaged in doing in the spiritual world. However, one never has to stop performing these activities when in relation to the Lord's service, because one will no longer be obliged to grow old and die once one is promoted to the spiritual world. There is a regulated process in how one should approach this transfer of consciousness from the material atmosphere to the spiritual reality. This process is revealed to us by the Lord through the medium of the spiritual masters. The intimate aspects of Krishna consciousness must be understood by one in purified consciousness, a consciousness detached from the material conception of life. If one is not purified of the material conception, one will certainly misinterpret the intimate aspects of Krishna consciousness. Now, there are many sources where one can hear about the intimate aspects of the Lord's activities and service. I have to strongly discourage you from doing this. This is very dangerous. Some make a business out of discourses on the Lord and His transcendental activities. Hearing about the Lord from such mercantile men is similar to drinking deadly poison. First of all, such spiritual entrepreneurs are completely unqualified to speak on the confidential service of the Lord. Generally, they will misconstrue the Lord's activities to be similar to the mundane affairs of this material world. In their hearts, they feel as if their expertise in interpreting the Lord is similar to how one would become expert at interpreting mythology. It is simply a business, a way to acquire some material benefit, such as wealth or aggrandizement from others. Therefore, from the very beginning, one who lends an oral reception to the discourses on the Lord from the inappropriate source will be misguided. One must hear of such confidential aspects of Krishna consciousness from the Lord's devotee. Generally, the most intimate aspects of Krishna consciousness are only spoken of in the association of pure unalloyed devotees of the Lord between each other. Now, in this particular time and place we all find ourselves, literature on the activities of the Lord and his instructions are hardly available if one is not guided on how to attain them. This is mainly because the books on these subject matters of Krishna consciousness, translated by Bhaktivedanta Swami from Sanskrit to English, have all been thoroughly revised by individuals unqualified to do so. Now, you will never be able to convince these individuals that they are unqualified. I'm certain that they did not make such revisions to their spiritual master's work with ill intent. However, remember how I illustrated in chapter 4. There is a duality within all of us. Without the proper understanding, it is very easy for one to be misguided in determination. Generally, unless one is specifically instructed otherwise, it is inappropriate to revise and edit the spiritual master's work after they have departed. To do so is opening the door to a great deal of confusion and mental speculation. Therefore, sadly, the revised versions of Bhaktivedanta Swami's writings, which are readily available, must be counted as spurious editions of that which was once genuine. One needs to go back and attain original copies of these literatures without the revisions. If one does not accept this guidance on how to attain these literatures, immediately one is locked out from the knowledge. This just goes to show exactly how confidential the subject matter of Krishna consciousness is. Now, as I've explained, for one who is not free from all material motivations, the Bhagavad Gita has been presented by the Lord to bring us to the transcendental platform. There must be a cleansing of the material conception of life to go any further than the Bhagavad Gita. How will one know when they have reached such a pure state of mind? One will be completely free from the desire to engage in any other activity than the Lord's service. Then one has reached the purified state of consciousness. If one is still inclined to hear of mundane subject matters of this material realm, one has not yet reached the purified condition. Therefore, one should focus on hearing the Bhagavad Gita in an attitude of humility and service. This will bring one to the purified condition, free from materialistic motivations. If one enters into the intimate activities of the Lord without coming to the purified platform, one will certainly misunderstand such topics and therefore commit offense. To jump ahead to these transcendental mellows concerning the Lord can be compared to showing up at a black tie event dressed in flip-flops and board shorts. It goes against all good etiquette to enter into the study of the intimate aspects of Krishna consciousness without acquiring the appropriate qualifications. So it is recommended one do the needed research and attain a copy of the Bhagavad Gita printed before Prabhupada left in 1977. This can easily be accomplished by using one of the many book services online. I would also recommend one secure a copy of the Srimad Bhagavatam, first canto. The first canto of the Bhagavatam is divided into 3 books. Find a copy of each printed 1977 or before. One should also obtain a copy of the Krishna book, printed before Prabhupada left. Krishna book is a summary of the 10th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam and is the most confidential literature on Krishna consciousness presented to us by Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. The printing of the Krishna book was done in 2 parts, sometimes in 3 parts. Find a copy of each book. Once you obtain a copy of these books, you should study them in the following manner. I recommend you begin your studies with the Bhagavad Gita. Carefully go through the Bhagavad Gita, embracing an attitude of service. I generally read the Bhagavad Gita every evening after I have made my daily offering to the Lord. After making my offering, I will read for a bit in a systematic way, going verse by verse, starting from the beginning. If at the end of your study of the Bhagavad Gita, if you feel you have not completely surrendered cent per cent to the service of the Lord, start from the beginning and read it again. If you spend your entire life systematically reading the Bhagavad Gita, you will have spent your life very wisely. When one is ready to move on to the next tier of studying the Lord's activities, one will know it because there will be no desire left to hear of anything other than the Lord's activities, and instructions. At this point, one has reached the advanced level of their study and is advised to begin reading the Srimad Bhagavatam from the very beginning of Canto 1. From this point, one will be thoroughly in communion with the Lord and can take guidance on how to progress in their studies from within. So this is the appropriate way to approach studying literatures on Krishna consciousness. The Lord is actually non-different from literatures of his activities and instructions. In the material conception, there are certainly divisions. I am not personally entering into the activities of the President by reading about them. In the spiritual reality, hearing of the divine activities of the Lord is non-different from being personally present witnessing such things. Therefore, there's a regulated process for entering into the studies on Krishna consciousness. It is certainly a bit difficult to conceptualize all this because we are limited to understanding what we can assimilate with our mental effort. The Lord, his activities, instructions, and spiritual abode are all outside the jurisdiction of our mental capacity. This must be accepted on faith by hearing from the spiritual masters. When one approaches the Lord in this manner, by hearing from the appropriate source, then one will gradually realize how the transcendental mystery of the Lord is situated. There is no other way to enter into these truths. Since the Lord is identical with literature on his nature, one can actually worship such literatures as one would worship the Lord. This is my program. I worship these original, unedited literatures by Bhaktivedanta Swami, as if the Supreme Lord is present in them, because ultimately the Lord is present in these literatures and can accept my service through this medium. As you can see, Krishna consciousness is very simple in reality. Many miss how simple it is and therefore are unable to assimilate it. Now moving on, I shall give a brief description of the incarnations of the Lord, as stated in a sense, similar to how every molecule of sunlight is an expansion of the sun itself. We are all expansions of the Lord. However, the expansions of the Lord can be divided into two categories. We are expansions of the Lord, yet do not possess the same attributes as the Lord in regards to potency. We are one with the Lord in quality, not quantity. The other category of the Lord's expansions possesses supreme attributes in quantity as well. These incarnations of the Lord are limitless and are appearing in this world to perform different activities. These expansions of the Lord are appearing similar to the many waves in the ocean breaking along the shoreline. As one incarnation of the Lord finishes his activities, another appears. No one can count the waves in the ocean and determine exactly how many exist. This is the inconceivable potency of the Supreme Lord. All of the Lord's incarnations display wonderful activities impossible for us. It can be a bit difficult to fully comprehend. The Lord's incarnations are all unique, yet still they are all emanating from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna. Krishna is not an incarnation. Rather, he is the source of the limitless incarnations. Just as a candle may ignite 1,000,000 candles, all the candles possess the same attributes as the first candle, yet still there is a distinction because the first candle is the origin of all others. An example, a very powerful man may have 10 sons. Now, each one of his sons may also have 10 sons. So, the father, at the end of life, may be surrounded by over 100 descendants. If this is possible for the part and parcel spiritual spark, just imagine how much more capable the Lord is of expanding his energy. There is no way to estimate the Lord's capacity to expand his energy. The Lord has expanded himself without limit, and in each one of these incarnations, he is executing inconceivably wonderful activities completely outside the jurisdiction of our comprehension. No one can assimilate why the Lord is engaged in such wonderful activities in total. We can have a glimpse into why the Lord performs such activities through his statements in the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita, chapter 4, texts 7 and 8. Whenever and wherever there is a decline in religious practice, O descendant of Bharat, and a predominant rise of irreligion, at that time I descend myself, in order to deliver the pious and annihilate the miscreants, as well as to reestablish the principles of religion. I advent myself, millennium after millennium. So the Lord is appearing to keep this material realm running on course. The Lord has a plan for the material realm and the spiritual beings situated in it. The Lord's plan is that all the spiritual beings situated here gradually become purified of the desire to become one in all respects with the Lord. In reality, it is never possible for the eternal spiritual part and parcel of the Lord to become one in all manners with the Lord. However, to interfere with their free will to desire such a situation would be interfering with their individuality. Therefore, this world is an opportunity to come to this realization independently. Now, naturally, there will be problems in the material realm because it is inhabited by individuals that have become bewildered due to false identification. If the Lord did not descend into this material realm to set things on course, he would indirectly be responsible for letting the entire world go to ruin. Therefore, the Lord continuously incarnates in different ways to teach us how to attain spiritual perfection and return home to the spiritual abode. It is described that in this current time period, the Lord does not annihilate the demons and miscreants. Rather, the Lord incarnates as the most perfect devotee in order to teach us by example how to engage in his own loving service. Instead of destroying the demons, the Lord destroys the demoniac mentality by descending as the most merciful incarnation of God, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. The event of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is quite elaborate in reality. I shall give a brief illustration of Lord Chaitanya's mission and appearance. There is an elaborate description offered by Bhaktivedanta Swami in the introduction to the Srimad Bhagavatam. So, this entire text is rooted in the teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Lord Chaitanya is described as being the most liberal incarnation of the Lord, making many allowances for one desiring to follow his path. However, Lord Chaitanya never made any allowances in the matters of illicit sex indulgence and meat eating. My spiritual authorities are all pure devotees of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Very soon, I will offer a description of the lives and accomplishments of these great souls. Now, Lord Krishna appeared a little over 5,000 years ago and demonstrated his eternal transcendental activities in the land known as Vrindavan in India. The mystery of the Lord's appearance in Vrindavan is a bit of a challenge to understand. Even though Krishna performs superhuman activities impossible for any common man, still, hardly anyone could understand him to be the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Most, even though in the Lord's presence, accepted him as similar to themselves. Now the Lord spoke the Bhagavad Gita to his friend and devotee Arjuna. The Bhagavad Gita was spoken at the beginning of a great battle, the battle of Kurukshetra. His final order in the Bhagavad Gita is to surrender to his loving service. The Lord did elaborate in depth on how to go about doing this. It is certainly explained thoroughly. However, the Lord desired to offer a more thorough lesson on how to surrender to his service. Therefore, he appeared as Lord Chaitanya about 500 years ago to give us a perfect example of how to engage in the loving service of Lord Krishna. Now, sometimes the common people, due to some hysteria, will elect an individual as an incarnation of God and worship them as such. This situation should not be confused with the real incarnation of the Lord. Great learned authorities on Vedic wisdom accept Lord Chaitanya as an incarnation of the Lord. This is the difference, because very few understood Lord Chaitanya's actual position as the Supreme through revelation. The Lord did not blatantly reveal himself to the masses as the Supreme. However, through the guidance of the spiritual masters, we can understand the position of Lord Chaitanya and his mission. This is a defining theme in Krishna consciousness. We can understand the Lord and his activities only through the bona fide spiritual masters. If one does not develop faith in the spiritual master, one can gain no admittance into the confidential activities of the Lord. So Lord Chaitanya is the perfect example of how to engage in his own loving service. See, this is the mercy of the Lord. His desire for our welfare is so intense that he personally came to give the perfect example of how to behave as a devotee engaged in the loving service of Krishna. Lord Chaitanya is described as the most merciful incarnation of the Lord because that which is very difficult to attain, love of God, is distributed by him freely. By following the path mapped out by Lord Chaitanya, one can easily attain the greatest treasure with little effort. The Lord's program for attaining love of God is rooted in hearing and chanting the names of Krishna. Therefore, chanting the Maha Mantra is accepted as a defining description of one who has accepted Lord Chaitanya in their heart. The Maha Mantra is as follows: Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Chanting the Lord's glories is the official business of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's devotees. Now, the intelligent, introspective person that has become familiar with the understanding of Krishna consciousness will develop a strong desire to attain the mercy of Lord Chaitanya. It is not practical in this day and age to attain the service of Lord Krishna without going through the medium of Lord Chaitanya. Some wish to focus their attention upon the intimate pastimes of Lord Krishna demonstrated by the Lord in his childhood in Vrindavan. In reality, personally, at this point in my spiritual development, I feel less than qualified to contemplate the intimate pastimes of the Lord. My focus must be defined as becoming the chaste follower of the devotees of Lord Chaitanya. This is actually where our entrance into the service of the Lord rests, in the instructions of Lord Chaitanya and his pure devotees. This entire text is rooted in these instructions, and the instructions of the Lord and his unallied devotees are non-different. Both the Lord and his devotees are very adamant about us surrendering to the mood of the Lord's loving service. Please do not jump ahead to the intimate activities of the Lord. Develop some faith in the Lord's devotees. Then, when one is ready to press onward in their service to the Lord, one can graduate to the next level in their understanding. At this point, I'd like to offer an illustration of the lives and accomplishments of my most prominent influences and authorities on Krishna consciousness. This is where this entire philosophy comes together, because personally, I am less than qualified to offer shelter to anyone. The great personalities responsible for our immediate entrance into this knowledge of the Lord are quite competent to offer shelter to us all. Now, as I mentioned, sometimes the masses will elect some individual as an incarnation of God and worship them as such. This again lends strength to the reality that this material world is full of traps. Generally, people do not actually want self-realization when it comes right down to it. This reality comes brightly into focus by taking into account how many cheaters and preachers with hidden motivations are readily available to the masses. Again, the Lord understands the hearts of all living entities. If one desires to be cheated, the Lord is obliged to send someone forward to cheat. Therefore, so many false prophets are available. These self-interested men of faith generally offer a plan for self-realization that involves no austerity whatsoever in regards to controlling the mind and senses. Do as you like, have as much sex as you want, drink wine, and become God. This is the nonsense they endorse. To the conditioned living entity in this world, this seems like a fantastic proposal. Therefore, such cheaters attract many followers. However, in reality, there can be no spiritual advancement without austerity and sense control. When the real spiritual master comes forward professing the real path to the Supreme, only the sincere seekers of knowledge lend an oral reception. So, my spiritual authorities are all direct representatives of Lord Chaitanya. Their lives are perfect examples of how to factually become engaged in the loving service of the Lord. This means that their only business is to propagate the Lord's service without exception. Now, there's a tendency for confusion to arise in understanding the position of the bona fide spiritual master. Some will equate the spiritual master to be non-different from the Lord. This is because there is generally a want for proper understanding concerning the individuality that exists in both the Lord and the eternal spiritual parts and parcels of the Lord. The most prominent example of this confusion is how Jesus Christ is understood. Now, there is certainly a great reverence that must be applied to the status of Jesus Christ, because to become such a famous servant of the Lord is not at all ordinary. Over 2,000 years later, there is not another servant of the Lord as famous as Jesus Christ. Therefore, his position is not at all ordinary. In Christianity, generally, it is accepted that there is the Father and the Son. Somehow, the Son becomes non-different from the Father, and individuality becomes blurred. This is due to the confusion that exists about our spiritual identity as individuals. Generally, when we think of our existence as individuals, we equate identity with suffering, because in the material realm, we are all individuals and are certainly subject to a variety of material miseries. The embodied living entity in the material realm sometimes carries this conception over to the eternal spiritual situation. Individuality equals suffering. Therefore, freedom from suffering means life without individualism. Therefore, there exists a fear of becoming an individual again. So, an inclination to annihilate individual identity takes root in the heart. This is how the conception of the spiritual master becoming the Lord manifests. The spiritual master is not the Lord. The spiritual master has knowledge of the Lord and is therefore given respect in the same manner as the Lord, yet the spiritual master and the Lord are eternally distinct personalities. Ultimately, since the transcendental understanding of the Lord's service is being delivered from the Lord, he is the original spiritual master. By delivering this understanding, the spiritual master becomes the representative of the Supreme Lord for the embodied spiritual beings in this world. The spiritual master is surrendered to the divine will of the Lord. Therefore, the Lord can act through the spiritual master and perform any activity that would generally be impossible. As stated, the Lord never interferes with anyone's independence as an individual. However, because the Lord is actually more subtle than the mind and senses, he can not only act through the spiritual master, the Lord can act through anyone at his discretion with little difficulty. This is the divine mystery of the Lord. I'd now like to give a brief description of the three personalities directly responsible for the Western world's access to this Vedic wisdom. See, the line of disciplic succession is similar to a military chain of command. It's a spiritual chain of command. The aspiration of the disciple is to carry out the orders of the superior. The disciples of Lord Chaitanya have been translating this knowledge from Sanskrit, the original language of Vedic literature, and distributing it in book form throughout the world for well over 100 years now. Therefore, we can understand that the desire of the Lord is that the entire world benefit from this Vedic knowledge, regardless of denomination. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada has had the greatest success in broadcasting this knowledge throughout the world. Even 40 years after his departure, we still find groups chanting the Maha Mantra of Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, in nearly every corner of the world. This would not be a reality if not for the hard work of Bhaktivedanta Swami. Bhaktivedanta Swami was born in 1886 as Abhay Charan D in the province of West Bengal, India, in the city of Calcutta. He was born and raised in modest circumstances as the son of a cloth merchant and devotee of Lord Krishna. In this way, from the very beginning of his life, Krishna consciousness was there. There was no meat eating at all present in his childhood environment. Bhaktivedanta Swami went his entire life without eating meat. Naturally, being raised in such a pure environment, he never embraced the sinful principles of illicit sex indulgence and intoxication. This is the blessing of being born into a family of pure religious personalities. During his childhood, his father would regularly engage in the loving service of the Lord by executing different devotional activities. Therefore, he was encouraged by his father from the very beginning of life to become engaged in the Lord's service. Bhaktivedanta Swami grew from childhood to an educated man, completing his studies at the prestigious Scottish Church College. In 1922, by divine arrangement, Bhaktivedanta Swami met his spiritual master, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. In the first brief meeting between the two men, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati gave Bhaktivedanta Swami his life mission. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati suggested that he preach Krishna consciousness to the Western world. Over the course of several decades, Bhaktivedanta Swami cultivated this order with great care. In 1944, Bhaktivedanta Swami printed his first publication in English entitled Back to Godhead Magazine. Back to Godhead Magazine continues to this day as a monthly publication printed by Prabhupada's organization, ISKCON. Prabhupada spent his life as a family man, engaging any energy he could in the service of the Lord. In 1950, Prabhupada retired from family life and moved to the holy town of Vrindavan, the place of the Lord's childhood pastimes. Prabhupada made residence at the Radha Damodar Mandir. This is a very famous temple in Vrindavan, established by the principal disciples of Lord Chaitanya nearly 500 years ago. Here, Prabhupada worked tirelessly, compiling literatures on the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. These prepared writings, translated from Sanskrit to English, were not simply revelations seen in dreams or meditation. All of Bhaktivedanta Swami's writings are based on literatures accepted in total by other scholarly sadhus in the same devotional line descending from Lord Chaitanya. This is the accepted process. It is said that ultimately a genuine devotee has no personal opinion on Krishna consciousness. A devotee is simply a channel for these eternal truths. So Srila Prabhupada was situated very nicely to finish life in the Lord's service. He had given up family attachments and was situated in the holy land of Vrindavan. By this time he had aged considerably. Generally, a spiritual-minded person would finish life at this point, situated in this most auspicious setting. However, despite having no real resources in America, Prabhupada was set on fulfilling the desire of his spiritual master by delivering this understanding of Krishna consciousness to the Western world. Therefore, after much endeavor, having prepared a printing of Srimad Bhagavatam, Prabhupada made arrangements to leave Vrindavan for the city of New York. In 1965, Bhaktivedanta Swami set sail from New York City by modest means upon a cargo freightliner named the Jaladuta. Basically, the circumstances were not ideal for such a journey. Prabhupada had secured a sponsor to meet him and provide very basic accommodations, nothing more. During this time, there were many yogis that made the association of aristocratic Westerners. They were hosted very luxuriously by the rich. Bhaktivedanta Swami did not have such conveniences. He was not set on entertaining the well-to-do to extract some aggrandizement and money. Bhaktivedanta Swami was set on fulfilling the order of his spiritual master by delivering the understanding of Krishna consciousness to the West. Therefore, Prabhupada arrived in New York City and in a grassroots fashion nurtured this movement of Krishna consciousness from a tender creeper into a flourishing spiritual society. There were many obstacles waiting to greet him in this endeavor, due to his undying faith in his spiritual master and Lord Krishna. Srila Prabhupada was able to overcome many impediments. After establishing a society for spreading Krishna consciousness, he traveled extensively throughout the entire world, circling the globe 14 times on lecture tours that took him to 6 continents. Srila Prabhupada initiated several thousand disciples into chanting the Hare Krishna mantra. All of his disciples were asked to promise to give up meat eating, illicit sex, intoxication, and gambling. They were also asked to chant a minimum amount of names of the Lord per day. So as you can see, his program was very serious. There was no lecturing on how to become God or other such nonsense. Srila Prabhupada preached on how to end all material suffering by becoming purified of the lower qualities of life, how to factually endeavor to become a genuine devotee of the Lord. After extensive writings and lecture tours, Srila Prabhupada departed, surrounded by disciples, on the 14th of November, 1977, in the holy land of Krishna's childhood pastimes, Sri Vrindavan. So, by taking into account Bhaktivedanta Swami's achievements in the service of the Lord, we can understand that he's a genuine devotee of the Lord. No one can have such success in the propagation of the Supreme Lord's service without being a devotee. Therefore, we should take the statements of Srila Bhaktivedanta Swami about the Lord's service very seriously. I would recommend only entering into the instructions of Bhaktivedanta Swami through book form in the manner I have explained. This is just my personal realization. This is a bit complicated. The technologies of internet, video, and audio are basically under stringent control by forces that are less than desirable. It certainly can be difficult to conceptualize. Regardless, the fact is that this element simply gets in the way in anything regarding these technologies, except in certain cases. This is my realization. Better to just stick to studying Bhaktivedanta Swami's books printed before Prabhupada departed. These literatures are full of transcendental potency and will surcharge one with spiritual life. All this needs to be taken very seriously because this is very serious business. An example, milk is full of nutritious qualities. However, if one drinks this same milk after it has been touched by a poisonous serpent, one will certainly die. This is the gravity of the situation. This transcendental knowledge does not mix well with these technologies. In special cases, this is not so, due to the situation of the proprietor of the media. In the case of Bhaktivedanta Swami's instructions, I would suggest sticking to genuine literatures printed by Prabhupada while he was personally present. The next personality I'd like to describe is Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He is responsible for our entrance into the understanding of Krishna consciousness. Bhaktivinoda Thakur is the pioneer of this wisdom for the modern man. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu appeared and stimulated the process of devotional service to the Lord through hearing and chanting the names and glories of Lord Krishna. This took place around 500 years ago. After Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's disappearance, there was a decline in purity within the faith. Gradually, all purity was diluted, and one could hardly find a single soul practicing faithfully. Before the contribution of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Krishna consciousness had diminished into being viewed by the public as simply a means for living at the cost of society by begging. There was little understanding of the actual breadth and depth of the great philosophy of Lord Chaitanya. This is a bit difficult to understand because one would assume that the progressive forward march of this great understanding would be uninterrupted, being directly inaugurated by Lord Chaitanya. So this lends strength to the fact that no one can understand the activities of the Lord in total. Only the Lord can understand his activities. Surely, without difficulty, the Lord could have set his movement on course without interruption. Yet, we could see that this is not how events have unfolded. The hard work of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur is the catalyst for revitalizing Krishna consciousness in modern times. He is practically responsible for single-handedly reestablishing the purity and sanctity to the pure loving service of Lord Krishna. Without his hard work, we would have little to no access to this understanding of Krishna consciousness. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur was born as Kadendranath Dutt on September 2nd, 1838, in the town of Birnagar, Bengal, India. He was born into opulent circumstances, yet would be challenged by many difficulties from the very beginning of life. Due to circumstance, his family, once wealthy, would become bereft of nearly all wealth and fortune. Throughout his life, Bhaktivinoda Thakur was drawn to spiritual understanding. However, as stated, there were very few following the faith of Krishna consciousness at the time. Vedic knowledge had become overwhelmingly dominated by the dry philosophical speculations of the impersonalists. Bhaktivinoda Thakur found little taste for such dry speculations. Therefore, he gravitated towards the devotional teachings of Christianity. He was well versed in the teachings of Christ also. By divine arrangement, Bhaktivinoda Thakur became inspired to thoroughly study the teachings of Lord Chaitanya. These teachings are all rooted in loving devotion to Lord Krishna. His contribution to reestablishing the faith and teachings of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu can hardly be summed up in my humble attempts. His writings of songs, essays, and books on the loving service of Krishna were incessant. I suggest that one find a copy of the book entitled Songs of the Vaishnava Acharyas, printed by the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust. Find a used copy, printed before Prabhupada departed if possible. I'd say get a used copy from any printing date if one cannot find one printed 1977 or earlier. Within this wonderful book are the most prominent songs by the Thakur. These songs are all brimming over with priceless insight into the loving attitude of one engaged in the Lord's service. One can only speculate the depth of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's realizations of the Lord's service. This becomes self-evident by reading and relishing his songs. Bhaktivinoda Thakur's songs and literatures are so vast in number, such a compilation can hardly be compared to the work of any other. We can understand through the Thakur's songs and writings that he was factually engaged in the Lord's transcendental pastimes while living in this world. Such an elevated spiritual status is achieved by only the most advanced devotees of the Lord. Bhaktivinoda Thakur was also a perfect example of how a practical man can become engaged in the Lord's service. He had a large family. We can understand that his cultivation of family life was also an act of devotional service to the Lord. One of his sons would become one of the greatest scholars and leaders of this Krishna conscious philosophy. The spiritual master of Bhaktivedanta Swami and renowned scholar on the service of Krishna, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, is the son of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. This is how a man should enter into family life, with the intention of bringing a pure devotee of the Lord into the world. Not only was Bhaktivinoda Thakur the father of a large family, he was entrusted as a magistrate judge for the government. He was respected as both a great spiritual leader and magistrate of the state. So, we can understand from the life of Bhaktivinoda Thakur that one can take on practical activities in material affairs and still be a devotee of the Lord. The devotional service of the Lord is not simply for the renunciate, it is for all. Bhaktivinoda Thakur is credited with the great achievement of rediscovering the authentic birthplace of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. The Thakur could understand that the place celebrated as the birthplace of Lord Chaitanya could not be accurate because it was situated in a town only 100 years in age. Through great perseverance and research, Bhaktivinoda Thakur rediscovered the genuine birthplace of Lord Chaitanya. So these are just a few of the glories of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. His example is a standard for which we should all strive. Somehow, even though a very responsible man, he found the time to make an unmatched contribution to the propagation of the Lord's service. This is the magnificence of the Lord's pure, unalloyed devotee. So, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur fully understood the Lord's desire that this great understanding of Krishna consciousness be broadcast throughout the world. Many could not fathom the idea of those born in the West being able to embrace the Vedic teachings. We can see that the teachings of Krishna consciousness have been well met throughout the entire world. Even in the distant lands of Africa, Asia, and South America, many have recognized the depth of the teachings of loving service to Lord Krishna and have taken it up wholeheartedly. The Thakur was the first to reach out to the Western world with the doctrine of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. In 1896, Bhaktivinoda Thakur published in English Gauranga Lila Smaranamangala, which translates into Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, his life and precepts. He sent copies of this text to many academic addresses throughout the Western world. This wonderful writing was well met by great scholars on theology throughout the West. In 1894, Bhaktivinoda Thakur retired from government service to dedicate himself to the Lord's loving service. In 1908, he accepted the lifestyle and practice of a Babaji. A Babaji is basically the highest spiritual order in Krishna consciousness. Once one accepts the Babaji order, one has no formal engagement in material activities whatsoever. This does not mean that the Thakur became inactive. He continued composing wonderful literatures and songs on the Lord's service until his departure on the 23rd of June, 1914. Through his example, we can understand how to become engaged in the loving service of the Lord, how to fully please the Lord. It's clear that if one truly wants to please the Lord, one must rigorously strive to give this wonderful gift of Christian consciousness to others. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur gave himself completely to broadcasting the loving service of the Lord to all men.